Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. It is just me this evening, but I do have a couple of great expert guests on particular stories. The others I'll be taking you through myself, so I hope you're interested in my opinions. We will be, or I will be, talking about prison overcrowding. It's meant that today has kick-started Operation Early Dawn, and we'll explain what that means. A new report has found the police are strip searching at least one child a day. I speak to a brilliant expert on that topic, and a senior diplomat in the Foreign Office has resigned over UK arms sales to Israel. Do stay tuned for all of that. As prospects for a ceasefire in Gaza appear to fade, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has traveled to Israel to push for a deal. Blinken met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu this morning. Netanyahu's office described the 3-hour meeting as positive and conducted in a good spirit. And it also added this: the Prime Minister reiterated Israel's commitment to the latest American proposal regarding the release of our hostages, taking into account Israel's security needs, which he insists on firmly. Now, last week, ceasefire negotiations involving Israel, the US, and Egypt took place in Qatar, with Hamas refusing to take part until a substantive proposal was put forward by Israel. At the center of the talks is a plan proposed by US President Joe Biden back in May. It involves a three-phase process involving the release of Israeli hostages and the withdrawal of IDF troops from Gaza, and would culminate in a permanent ceasefire. But Netanyahu reportedly later added terms to the deal that were unacceptable to Hamas, including Israeli control of the Gaza-Egypt border and restrictions on the movements of Palestinians in Gaza. On Friday, the US, Qatar, and Egypt presented a so-called bridging proposal aimed at closing the gaps between Hamas and Israel. But over the weekend, neither Hamas nor Israel appeared happy. Hamas accused Netanyahu of seeking to sabotage the deal, saying the proposal put forward in Qatar took account of Israeli demands, but not theirs. And the group, along with Palestinian Islamic Jihad, have claimed responsibility for a bomb blast in Tel Aviv on Sunday night. The person carrying the bomb was killed and a passerby was injured. In a statement, Hamas's military wing said their, quote, martyrdom operations would return to Israel as long as, quote, the occupation's massacres and assassination policy continue. Meanwhile, on Sunday, Benjamin Netanyahu said, we are conducting negotiations and not a scenario in which we just give and give. There are things we can be flexible on, and there are things that we cannot be flexible on, which we will insist on. We know how to distinguish between the two very well. For the US and many Arab states, a ceasefire in Gaza is thought to be the best way to avert growing tensions, if not all-out war, in the Middle East. Iran has promised a fierce retaliation against Israel for its assassination of Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran last month, though Israel has neither confirmed nor denied responsibility for the killing. On the same day, Israel also assassinated a senior Hezbollah official in South Beirut, an act the IDF has admitted to. That's led to an intensification of cross-border fighting between the southern Lebanese armed group and Israel, including the killing of 10 Syrian civilian workers in Lebanon on Saturday. Meanwhile, Israeli fighter jets have been terrorizing Beirut residents for the last 3 weeks by creating sonic booms over the city. That was the sound of children screaming in Beirut today as Israeli pilots used their jets to create the sound of explosions. And it's in that context of the region heating up that Blinken, standing with Israeli President Isaac Herzog, stressed the importance of further talks set to take place in Cairo this week.
This is a decisive moment, probably the best, maybe the last opportunity to get the hostages home, to get a ceasefire, and to put everyone on a better path to enduring peace and security. I'm here as part of an intensive diplomatic effort on President Biden's instructions to try to get this agreement to the line and ultimately over the line. It is time for it to get done. It's also time to make sure that no one takes any steps that could derail this process. And so we're working to make sure that there is no escalation, that there are no provocations, that there are no actions that in any way could move us away from getting this deal over the line, or, for that matter, escalating the conflict to other places and to greater intensity. I know this is a fraught moment in Israel. with deep concern about the possibility of attacks coming from Iran, coming from Hezbollah, and other sources. But the focus of my visit is intensely on getting the hostages back, getting the ceasefire done. It is time for everyone to get to yes and to not look for any excuses to say no.
Earlier today, I spoke to analyst and former Israeli negotiator Daniel Levy. I began by asking him why Blinken called this potentially the last chance to secure a ceasefire.
It's a bizarre thing for a lead diplomat to say. It could possibly make sense if this were a push wrapped with leverage and he had put threats on the table with the party that the United States has armed and backed and enabled. But is he saying that the US would not even pretend to be interested in ending the devastation in Gaza, in the fate of the Israelis being held in Gaza, if this doesn't work? Is this Blinken's personal swan song? It's his last attempt. This is 9 visits. What a staggering record of failure. It's not just Blinken, of course. Is this him saying, look, we've just signed off on the 20 billion in additional arms sales. So, you do your worst. It's really impossible in the context of the actual efforts around Gaza, if one were to take those at face value to understand what Blinken is saying. And so I think one perhaps has to widen one's aperture to understand where this might be coming from. And there, I think this might be less about Gaza and more about Tehran and Chicago. Not immediately obvious, perhaps, what that means. But I think the US is trying here to prevent this wider regional escalation. You have had the latest wave of highly provocative Israeli extrajudicial killings in Tehran. The political leader of the Hamas movement, Ismail Haniyeh, during the ceremony to swear in the new Iranian president just some weeks ago, and the killing of the senior Hezbollah commander, Shukr, in Beirut. And so I think what is being attempted here is to use these talks as a way of saying to Iran, you've got a ladder, hold your fire, and also as part of the threat on Iran, you will be blamed, and the US is increasing its military deployment in the region. So one eye focused on that. The second is we are now in money time when it comes to the US election, and we are in the week of the Democrat Party convention in Chicago. I think there's a deep interest in that not being caught up in the tumult of the opposition to what's happening in Gaza, of the political vulnerability at home of the Dem administration on that issue, and therefore being able to have Chicago say, hey, Blinken's in the region. This is the last big effort. We're making progress. Just trust us, which no one should have any reason to do. I think that's where they're focused. What happens to the people in Gaza who still suffer daily mass civilian killing events at the hands of the Israeli military every day is apparently relegated to a distant third concern.
I understand the point about choreography when it comes to Chicago and the Democratic National Convention. I think obviously, having Blinken there saying we're trying really hard for a ceasefire, especially when you've got a very compliant media at the moment, not particularly sort of holding Kamala Harris's feet to the fire. The idea that you've got a Democrat in Israel saying we really want a ceasefire, yes, maybe that can be spun in the United States to make the Democrats look a little bit better. I'm still struggling to understand how this works in Tehran, because I'm presuming that in Tehran, no one is really buying this line that the Americans are really looking for a ceasefire. So if you're trying to stop escalation, then how does Blinken's presence in Israel sort of make a difference? Is it just merely the fact of him being there means that Tehran are less likely to, I suppose, try anything to retaliate for Israeli assaults?
If one looks at what you've just set up, what is going on, I would argue, is that, yes, there is an attempt here to say to the Iranians, watch out and don't undermine this. And we're giving you a de-escalatory ladder. And if we can play this out for long enough, then the ability on your side, on Hezbollah's side, to justify any escalation against the backdrop of something that begins to become a distant memory is that much more complex for those parties. And the US does have an interest. Let's not forget that there's a geopolitical piece of this, that the US does have an interest in its Israeli ally, which it sees as part of its axis against Iran, Russia, China, not being in such a weakened position. The balance of power has shifted against Israel during this war. So having Israel be able to still conduct what are considered to be these spectacular assassinations, they don't impact the strategic or military equation particularly, but they look good, so to speak. Israel being able to do that without there being a counter reaction does restore some escalation dominance, does restore some deterrence, and the US has an interest in that. That's its geopolitical calculation. At the same time, there are those in the administration who, having preemptively made the decision that they will not use leverage on Israel, the weapons will continue to flow. They are not willing to put pressure to stare down the Israeli leader, who is the most dangerous, unpredictable actor in this whole picture. Having done that, they are now convincing themselves, you know what, maybe we could get a deal. We've told ourselves that the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is on summer recess, so Netanyahu has less coalition worries. We're playing this really smart game. I think some of them genuinely are telling themselves that this is really smart. We're working with the Israeli security establishment. We give them more guarantees of weapons, billions more in assistance, so they're more beholden to us. So they'll win the internal Israeli argument. The hostage families are out there protesting. Surely Netanyahu's going to listen to all of that. But it doesn't add up. It's wishful thinking. It ignores that by handling things in this way, by taking Israeli positions and turning those into American mediation proposals, you do two things. You remind Netanyahu of something he has been quite confident of all along, which is that he has the upper hand in this relationship between the US and Israel. And therefore, there is not a disincentive for him to continue, nor an incentive for him to bring this to an end. And secondly, you pretty much guarantee that Hamas is not going to look at this and say, oh, fair enough, these look very reasonable proposals, that there are no Israeli fingerprints on this whatsoever. They throughout have conducted themselves on the American side as if it doesn't matter whether any of the Hamas goals, some of which we have to acknowledge are legitimate. Israel is legitimate in claiming the right to security for its people. Hamas is legitimate in some of its claims, including ending this genocidal campaign in Gaza. And so if you are absolutely uninterested in giving a victory narrative to both parties, then you pretty much guarantee that Hamas is not going to go along with this. Why should it? And therefore, one can imagine Blinken and Netanyahu having a relatively positive meeting today, because Netanyahu looks across the table and sees someone who continues to be willing to carry water and to lie when he tells us time and again that the one problem is with Hamas.
We're 10 months into this war. What are the IDF doing in Gaza at the moment? I mean, obviously, sort of every week we hear about another atrocity committed, but is there a sort of strategic aim they're still trying to achieve? I know sort of months ago we were talking about destroying Hamas tunnel networks. I mean, what are the IDF actually sort of doing on a day-to-day basis? What are they trying to achieve in Gaza?
One of the things that if people were to dip into the Israeli media, whether outlets like Haaretz and their military correspondent Amos Harel or other things in translation, what you would see is a quite consistent set of background briefings by the security establishment saying we should do the deal. The deal is a better option. There is a lot of fatigue on the Israeli military side, reservists who've been there for an awfully long time. The Israeli defense minister turned around just last week and said the idea of total victory is an illusion. His prime minister turned around and called that an anti-Israel narrative. He didn't go the whole hog, which we're used to of calling it anti-Semitic. But What the Israeli military, I think, would be more interested in is getting a deal, getting some respite, regrouping, either because there's going to be an escalation in the north, or by getting a ceasefire in Gaza, you actually kickstart the prospect of getting a deal in the north and getting a regional quiet. Now, I think that's much of the senior echelon of the military. Not that they haven't absolutely been at the forefront of running this horrendous campaign. And I draw a distinction between that and some of the junior command levels and many of the soldiers who have been posting these horrific, self-incriminating videos time and again. But that's where the senior echelon is at, which is why partly the Americans are saying, well, surely, Netanyahu will listen to this. And if anyway, because this is the other thing that's going on, what you are seeing is, yes, they continue to go after, what they will call Hamas command post. I think a lot of this is the elusive buying of the lottery ticket to get Sinwar every day. But actually, you're going to see a winding down of operations. Sadly, that will not necessarily mean a winding down of the civilian killings and an improvement in the humanitarian situation. But you are going to see that winding down. In that context, why not do a deal? And then you get into the territory of, for Netanyahu, actually keeping the option of an open-ended war going, not closing a deal, even if that prevents the Israelis being held coming home, is a better political option.
That was Daniel Levy speaking to me earlier today, and I suppose really highlighting how just completely historically bizarre I think it is for the United States to be giving Netanyahu everything he wants, right? If even the Israeli security establishment, obviously Israel, massive ally of the United States, obviously I don't think it should be, given the way it behaves, but it is. And Daniel Levy, they're saying even the Israeli security establishment kind of want a deal, right? The only person holding out for one is Netanyahu, for his own political career. And the Americans seem to be willing to risk a wider Middle Eastern war, and obviously they've already cost tens of thousands of Palestinian lives. And for what, right? For what? British prisons are already full up, and the recent arrest of more than 1,000 people in connection with far-right race riots risks tipping them over capacity. To address that problem, the government has launched Operation Early Dawn, a program aimed at easing prison overcrowding. But people working in the sector have told Prime Minister Keir Starmer that the measure won't be enough to repair a broken system. So what is Operation Early Dawn? Well, it's a long-standing contingency plan that will allow defendants to be held in police cells until prison space becomes available. Police cells are usually only used to hold defendants for short periods of time while under questioning, awaiting trial, or before transfer to prison. But under Early Dawn, defendants will remain in police cells until they're called to court. And this is the important bit. They'll only be called to court when it's been confirmed that, should they get a custodial sentence, a prison space will be available. Now, that's likely to mean long delays to cases being heard in court, with Tom Franklin of the Magistrates Association saying this: every case that is delayed has real-life consequences for victims, witnesses and defendants, and leads to magistrates and court staff sitting around waiting rather than administering justice. That is a waste of resources at a time when there are already large backlogs. So how crowded are our prisons? Well, there are currently nearly 90,000 people in prison, just a little more than there were in 2011. And yet the prison population is much closer to maximum capacity than it was back then. Roughly half of all prisoners are also now in crowded rather than decent accommodation. So why have prison standards fallen so drastically? Well, this was the chairman of the Prison Officers Association, Mark Fairhurst, on BBC Breakfast.
In all of this, what are prison officers saying about the current situation, how challenging things are?
Well, it's been an extremely pressured situation for several months now because we are so full. And that's down to the previous government. Let's be honest about this. They closed 20 public sector prisons. They didn't build enough new prisons, didn't create enough prison space. And people are serving longer sentences. So as we're more overcrowded, there's less regime we can offer. We don't have activity spaces for everybody in our care. That leads to frustrations, and frustrations spill over onto the front line. We work in the most hostile and violent workplace of anywhere in the world. It's absolutely horrific.
Fairhurst mentioned longer sentencing there. Obviously, if people spend longer in prisons, the less turnover of prison spaces there will be, which in turn leads to overcrowding. And according to research from the Financial Times, Fairhurst is very much right. So since 2010, courts have been increasing the length of sentences handed down for most criminal offences. Average prison sentences for sexual offences have increased by about 35%, from 50 months to around 68 months, and public order and drug offences have each increased by 30%. That's almost an extra year for drug crimes and a couple of months added to the sentences for public order offences. According to Fairhurst, the tightness in the prison system is likely to ease up in the coming months.
Our actual operational capacity that we can safely house prisoners is around about 79,000.
Right.
Now, we've got to get through these next 3 weeks, because on the 10th of September, under the 40% rule on sentences, we're going to release about 2,500 prisoners, and then another tranche a month later. So all in all, after these new measures, we will probably have a bit of breathing space and release about 5,500 prisoners. That will enable us, hopefully, to stabilise our prisoners, offer a predictable and productive regime for people, and claw it back.
That 40% rule was brought in by Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood in July in an effort to avoid prison overcrowding. I mean, it only applies to people serving determinate sentences and excludes sex offenders, violent criminals, or most violent criminals, and people imprisoned under counter-terrorism laws. Now, this is a really interesting story on prisons. We've talked about it a few times on Novara Live over the last couple of months, and that's because it really was the first crisis that hit the Labour government. Now, that was because the Conservative Party had put more people in prisons than we have prison spaces, right? It's sort of a basic maths problem. Apparently, Rishi Sunak was warned about this before the election, but didn't want to do anything about it until after the election, because he thought that early releases wouldn't be a great introduction to his re-election campaign. So it's very much left for the Labour Party. And then, you know, if you're just entering government, you've already got a prisons crisis, and then you have a series of far-right riots where you have 1,000 people that might have to go to jail. That is obviously a very difficult situation. So I do have some sympathy with them here. I suppose what to do about it, I mean, you will have seen potentially debates we've been having on the show, discussions with my colleague Dahlia, who's very much a sort of abolitionist. I'm very much not an abolitionist. At the same time, it is unclear what we are achieving, or what we have achieved since 2010, by sort of increasing the average sentence for something like robbery from 35 months to 45 months, right? Oh, maybe the public are safer for 10 months, right? What does that achieve? It's not obvious to me. And having spoken to a lot of people about this and read a lot about this, it seems that, I mean, the easiest win when it comes to this is not necessarily letting out a load of people. I mean, obviously we have to do that in the short term, but it is, how do you make prisons a place where you actually can rehabilitate people? Because that is the one thing which everyone from every side of the political spectrum seems to accept is not happening now. Probably it's not going to be possible for everyone, however good your prison system is, but our prison system is an absolute disaster. So people locked up for 22 hours a day. You saw there the guy from the Association of Prison Governors talking about what a horrible place prisons are to work. And that does seem really true, right? I was researching the other podcast I do called Crash Course. So I've got a long interview with Cassia Rowland, who we've had on here a couple of times. She was talking about the disaster that's in the prison system. We're talking to Ian Aitchison, who's a former prison governor, soon as well. And in my research for this, I was looking at prison officers giving interviews, often sort of with an actor doing their voice, because you know, they're whistleblowers essentially. And they're saying that on a daily basis, and this was in a new prison, this wasn't even an old prison, it was a new privately run prison, they were getting shit and piss thrown at them. Someone got stabbed in the head. This is like a prison governor. There are all these videos of prisoners having like booze parties in their cells. Now, this is not to say it's easy being in prison, because actually I think being in a prison where the guards aren't in control is actually probably more hellish for most people than being in a prison where they are in control, because that means your safety is not guaranteed, right? If you've got a prison which is run by gangs instead of run by prison officers, probably your treatment is going to be even more arbitrary than it would be if it was a well-organized prison. So this seems to be a complete mess. Also interesting, I mean, there's so many elements where the Conservative Party, who like to think of themselves as the party of law and order, via austerity, allowed for law and order to completely break down. Now, we should be clear here, because I do, you know, it annoys me sort of on right-wing TV channels and sort of in the right-wing press, where we're always given this image that crime is out of control, it's too dangerous to go out on the street. People say London has fallen, right? Crime on the whole is down. It's been falling since the 90s. Now that probably doesn't have too much to do with criminal justice policy. It has a lot more to do with CCTV and also video games. Most crime is committed by young men. If young men aren't out on the street bored, but at home playing video games, might not be great for their social life, but it is quite good for reducing crime numbers. So crime is down. Britain isn't more dangerous than it was in the past, but prisons are a much sort of worse place to be now than they were, I think, basically under New Labour, when there was serious money going into it. So what should Labour do? I suppose they're going to have to let some people out on early sentences, but you're going to have to put a lot more money into this system so that it isn't a hellish place to work. And so I think the turnover is just atrocious, phenomenally high. And then make sure that, you know, you are giving people something to do when they're in prison. Because having prisons is a useless place to be, and then saying, well, we're going to increase the time you're there from 35 months to 45 months. It just seems, I don't see what that achieves. I think this is, you know, just one of the most clear disasters of Conservative policymaking. And Keir Starmer is actually quite right to sort of blame the problems on a terrible inheritance the Tories bequeathed to Labour on prisons. Police in England and Wales strip-searched a child every 14 hours over the past 5 years. That's the finding of a new report by Britain's Children Commissioner, Dame Rachel de Souza. 88% of these searches were carried out on suspicion of drug offences, and in 45% of cases, an appropriate adult was not confirmed to be present when the search took place. In the past year, black children were 4 times more likely to have been subject to a strip search than white children. The practice is known to cause considerable trauma for children. A mum of a boy who was strip-searched aged 14 recounted her child's experience to the BBC.
He was strip-searched and then left naked in the cell. It's sexual abuse of a child. This is happening to mainly marginalised black children.
He was arrested on suspicion of possessing cannabis and claims it was a small amount for personal use. Now in his 20s, he's been left with long-term trauma and is a vulnerable adult with serious mental health conditions, including psychosis and schizophrenia.
The new report by the Children's Commissioner is the latest in a series of investigations that followed the case of the strip search of a black student in Hackney in 2020. So back then, a 15-year-old girl known as Child Q was taken out of an exam to the school's medical room and strip-searched by 2 female Met Police officers who were looking for cannabis. Teachers remained outside. No other adult was present. Her parents were not contacted, and no drugs were found. According to a subsequent review into that event, the girl's intimate body parts had been exposed, and she was made to take off her sanitary towel. So she was on her period at the time. Now, following a review into that situation and protests in the local area, the Met Police apologised for the treatment of Child Q. And in her report, Rachel de Souza says some positive changes have been implemented since Child Q's mistreatment. There were 42% fewer strip searches of children in 2022 than in 2020, and there has been an improvement in the number and quality of safeguarding referrals. But speaking to the BBC, the Children's Commissioner was clear there is still much more to be done.
There are really clear rules, statutory rules around them. So there should be an appropriate adult, which is a parent, or it could be a social worker, but someone, you know, who the child has there as who can watch out for them. They're meant to be done in the police station or at the child's home. Too many of them were done in public places that others could see. And, you know, there are really clear rules. It worries me also that like 88% or so of them were done, you know, on suspicion of drugs. This is a really intimate search with over, and only a small percentage done on suspicion of violence or harm. My argument is they should only be done if it's a life-threatening situation. Let me just remind viewers, this is pre-arrest. This is a child there's just a suspicion, they're taken, there's meant to be an appropriate adult there, in 45% of cases there are not, and their clothes are removed and their most intimate parts looked at and moved if necessary. It's really very intrusive, and, you know, it's hard to see, given that only about half of the strip searches have further action taken, and a far smaller percent actually end up with charges, that they've been done because it's really, really crucial for life and death that they've been done. And that, to me, is the benchmark that really needs to be there.
To discuss more about D'Souza's findings, I'm joined now by Shabnah Begum, CEO of the Runnymede Trust. Shabnah, can I get your general response to these findings from the Children's Commissioner?
I think we're not very surprised at the fact that we continue to see a significant use of strip searching of children in our policing. I think that the indication is that there's been a reduction in some of those numbers overall, particularly in the last year. But I think that overall the numbers remain far too high, and that's not surprising given what we know about the kind of policing culture that we have in this country.
Are strip searches ever justified for children? I mean, because it does sound like a very traumatic situation. I understand the Children's Commissioner has said the bar should be higher than it currently is. I mean, would you just ban the practice, or do you think that it still can be justified in certain situations?
No, our position is really clear, actually, Michael. We do think that we should ban the practice of strip searching children. If we go back to where this whole conversation started, we know that the scrutiny of strip searching children began with the strip search of child Q, who was a 15-year-old girl who was sitting a mock exam in her school hall when her teachers thought that they smelled cannabis. They escorted her to another room and they searched her, didn't find anything. So they decided that they would call the school safety officer. The police officers came to the school. They then subsequently strip searched child Q, a 15-year-old girl, in a school office. She was on her period. She was asked to remove her sanitary equipment. She was asked to expose her intimate body parts, and nothing was found. And that kind of strip searching of children isn't an extraordinary or an exceptional encounter. The stats reveal that over the last 5 years, we've seen over 3,000 children exposed to those kinds of strip searches. And most of those are for the kind of reasons for that were involved with child Q, where you've got someone who thinks 88% of them have been for the suspicion that someone is in possession of drugs.
On those drugs charges, I mean, there's two types of drugs charges, I suppose. One is just possession. You know, oh, this might be a child who's got weed. And then the idea that you'd strip search them, I mean, to me does seem completely disproportionate. I suppose the other is dealing and potentially county lines. And I suppose one scenario I've been thinking of today is sort of, if you did ban strip searching altogether, then would that make children even more attractive as drug mules? Because, you know, if you're sending your, a vulnerable young person out to deal drugs on county lines, then you know that so long as they put the drugs in their underwear, say, it's impossible for the police to find it. So is there could we be creating, I suppose, dangerous incentives if we were to completely outlaw the practice?
Yeah, again, I think that this idea that we are taking a safeguarding and a children's well-being approach to this, and that being the priority reason for the strip searching, is really kind of an absurd way of thinking about it. We really need to kind of be cognizant of how brutal these strip searches are, how regularly they're used. The report indicates that we're talking about a strip search on average every 14 hours of children as young as 8. And whilst I accept there may well be some kind of situations where we might need to have some extraordinary intervention to figure out whether a child is potentially being exploited and used for the purposes that you described, the kind of routine way of strip searching in unreported locations, sometimes in front of kind of fast food restaurants, in the back of police vans, it's become a complete kind of it's become a real policing culture where we think that it's totally acceptable for police to be able to behave this way and to use those powers in really aggressive ways. When we know, if we're thinking about harm to children and exploitation of children and the abuse of children, actually what we do know for 100% sure is that strip searches have long-term psychological impacts on the children who experience it, as well as the the families who have to cope with the aftermath. And I know that some of the research has shown, for example, one child described it as being state-sanctioned child abuse. That's how it felt. So I think that where we're talking about and using child protection as the reason for why we would enable the police, which we know is institutionally racist and has disproportionately used these powers against Black children, when we use the children's welfare argument in order to justify it, I really think we have to question the logic of that.
I suppose when it comes to violent crime, knife crime, I mean, no one wants people to be able to walk around with knives and have a sort of opt-out whereby they can't sort of get found. I mean, I suppose in a way there aren't really many violent weapons you can hide in your underwear. So, I mean, I suppose it doesn't seem like strip searching would be a particularly useful tool if you're trying to tackle knife crime. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Even the evidence indicates only 6% of the strip searches of over 3,000 children were for suspicion of carrying a weapon. And listen, I'm a mum. I've got 2 teenage children. I don't want my children to be in situations where they're around people who might be carrying knives. But I certainly don't think strip searching children is the answer to the kind of situations and conditions that we find ourselves in, where we kind of have a conversation about strip searching, whether the strip searching of children is right or wrong. We should be having a conversation really about why it is that children are carrying knives, why it is that children are being exploited. And I think we focus far too much in this country on a policing solution to some of the social problems that exist and really kind of fail to address the root problems, which are to do with the material and social economic conditions that these children find themselves in.
With Child Q, this was a case of sort of teachers calling the police. I mean, say you're a teacher and there's a kid in your school who you think's got drugs, you can't find it in their pockets. It's a very basic question, but what is it that you do? What are you supposed to do in that situation as sort of like a teacher who's not sure whether the person has brought drugs into school?
You know what? I was actually a teacher before I came to the Runnymede Trust, and I was teaching at a school in Hackney, a neighbouring school to the Child Q school, where that event happened. And as a teacher, your primary duty is to look after the child. And so, if you do think a child has got drugs or is exposed to drugs in some way, then you have responsibility to safeguard that child. You have a responsibility to call the parent, actually, or parent or the guardian. And I think that the Child Q incident revealed the complete failure of the system then, because actually that child was strip searched in school by police officers and then was sent home, and her parent was never called. It was her parent who then subsequently followed up with calling her GP because her daughter was so distressed. So I think there's a real failure. We have this kind of surveillance securitization culture where we think of a punitive response immediately to a situation without thinking about what's best for the child. How do we support the child in that situation that you've described? We immediately go for kind of the policing security response, not the pastoral response. And again, coming back to that wider question of what happened with Child Q, again, I was a teacher for 20 odd years, teaching in inner city schools, teaching in Hackney for the bulk of them. And what we saw completely stripped out from our schools is all of the pastoral support, all the mentors, all the coaches. But actually what you saw as part of the fixed part of the furniture of the school was those Safer Schools officers. So having police in schools and having that as part of the kind of fundamental delivery of a school, but not necessarily having the welfare pastoral support that children need. So again, it speaks to that real kind of policing and punitive culture that we've kind of dropped into, and we've kind of, we're so drenched in it that we don't even see it, that actually we have to have a conversation about whether, strip searching should be allowed or not. That shouldn't be the conversation. It should be given that children should be protected, their right to their privacy, their dignity, their welfare should always be paramount.
Do you know how we compare to comparable countries on something like this? I suppose that, the way this is being talked about in the media is that, it's getting slightly better, but there's still a big problem and the threshold needs to be very high for strip searching. Your position, which I think much of our audience will find very persuasive, is we just shouldn't do them at all. What is sort of international, best practice is maybe a loaded term, but sort of what is the international norm when it comes to policing young people in situations like this?
Again, I think it's a really mixed picture. I think that kind of, when we think about UN rights of the child, there are lots of countries that observe that and really think about welfare and dignity of the child and would protect children with legislation against this kind of strip search. But there are others who are kind of as bad as us in terms of the extension of police powers in the way that we've described. But it's become normalised and it's crept into our psyche. But it wasn't normal. It wasn't something that was normal kind of going back 20, 30 years. We wouldn't consider strip searching of children and the kind of exposure of their intimate parts to police officers in undisclosed locations. We wouldn't consider that normal. It's not normal. It shouldn't be normal. And I think we really need to kind of shift the conversation on this.
Of course, this child commissioner was appointed under Boris Johnson, but we now got a new government. What kind of noises are you hearing from the Labour Party on issues such as this?
Well, it's interesting. So the previous government did start a consultation. They started a consultation which ended in early summer. So this new Labour government will have got all of the evidence submitted as part of that consultation. And we were amongst a whole range of charities, think tanks, academics, legal experts, children's rights campaigners, all of whom would have submitted evidence. And so I really hope we go for an evidence-based approach to the policy development on this, because I think the evidence points to the fact that actually, A, it's harmful, and B, it doesn't even do the job that it's supposed to do. This idea that it's used in these extraordinary, exceptional circumstances is a dishonest account of when they're used. And so I hope that the new Labour government will look at the evidence, take an evidence-based approach, and really review the rights of police officers, an institutionally racist police force that we know has existed for decades now, and review and suspend their right to strip search children.
A senior British diplomat has resigned over Israel's war on Gaza, calling the British government potentially complicit in Israeli war crimes. Mark Smith was a counter-terrorism official based in the British Embassy in Dublin. Previously, he had also advised the government on arms sales to countries in the Middle East. On Friday, his resignation letter to the Foreign Office was leaked online. In it, Smith said this: "There is no justification for the UK's continued arms sales to Israel, yet somehow it continues. I have raised this at every level in the organisation, including through an official whistleblowing investigation, and received nothing more than, 'Thank you, we have noted your concerns.'" Ministers claim that the UK has one of the most robust and transparent arms export licensing regimes in the world. However, this is the opposite of the truth. As a fully cleared officer raising concerns of illegality in this department, to be disregarded in this way is deeply troubling. It is my duty as a public servant to raise this. Smith has now spoken out about his attempts to raise the alarm in the Foreign Office. Speaking to the Today programme, he revealed this.
Anybody who has a kind of basic understanding of these things can see that there are war crimes being committed, not once, not twice, not a few times, but quite flagrantly and openly and regularly.
Did you raise this internally, this view?
Yes. So I raised it with the new Foreign Secretary, and I raised it at pretty much every level in the organisation. That's my duty, and that would be quite normal, I think, for public servants. We're very used to upholding the law, and so we would normally raise things internally that we might have a question over, particularly if we have subject matter specialism, as I do. So I raised it internally.
And how did the Foreign Secretary respond? I'm
not at liberty to kind of go into detail about exactly how that internal process went, but I resigned from my role, and I resigned because of this issue. So you can put the pieces together, but suffice it to say that any response was not satisfactory.
So that's a clear suggestion there that the new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, wasn't particularly interested in expert advice when it comes to Israeli war crimes. And despite being potentially explosive, the UK media initially appeared to do its best to keep Smith's resignation out of the public eye. The story was broken by former vice journalist Hind Hassan, who published Smith's resignation letter online on Friday. That was quickly followed by reports in Middle East Monitor, Squawk Box, and Scottish newspaper The National. But it was only on Sunday that Sky and The Guardian wrote the story up, with further reports finally appearing in the broadsheets and on the BBC on Monday. The Foreign Office has now responded to the story, saying this: the government is committed to upholding international law. We have made clear that we will not export items if they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. There is an ongoing review process to assess whether Israel is complying with international humanitarian law, which the Foreign Secretary initiated on day one in office. Day one of Foreign Secretary David Lammy's time in office was 6 weeks ago, given that in that time Israel has blown up several schools, attacked the ever-shrinking humanitarian zone in Gaza multiple times, assassinated 2 political leaders on foreign territory, and seen its citizens protest the arrest of soldiers accused of raping Palestinian prisoners with broom handles. You have to wonder, how much more evidence does David Lammy need? And adding to the overwhelming case against Israel are a group of humanitarian organizations, including Al-Haq and Amnesty International. Their lawyers have submitted witness statements documenting war crimes to a UK court as the NGOs seek a ban on British arms exports to Israel. The witness statements from Western and Palestinian aid workers in Gaza will be used to bolster the case that Israel is breaching international humanitarian law in the enclave. This is what The Guardian reports on the statement of one witness, Canadian medic Ben Thompson. He testified that when he visited the tent city in Rafah in March, water was rationed to 3 litres a day, and there was one toilet for every 800 people. One toilet for every 800 people. He said he was forced to reset bones without pain medication, and that on one occasion, such was the overcrowding in a hospital that a man in his care died on the floor in a pool of his own blood and brain matter. In his own blood and brain matter. Now, these are the kind of statements, sentences, like it's just unbelievable that we're 10 months into this war. We've been reading statements like this for 10 months. You know, actually the most deadly phase of the war was in those first couple of weeks, right? That was when they were killing just whole families in one go, and loads of them. Obviously, the atrocities are continuing. And Labour is still, as far as I understand, not publishing their legal advice. So there's this constant sort of, oh, we're looking into it. Maybe we'll stop arms sales at some point in the future. It's been very clear to see for 10 months that we are funding a genocidal war, right? That we are selling arms to a government that is bombing women and children. And as we talked about sort of with Daniel Levy at the start of this show, this is not a war which is achieving any goal which the British government should be supportive of, right? This is not about the right to self-defense for an ally, for a people, right? This is, I mean, on the most crude level, it's a political leader, Netanyahu, who wants to save his skin. So he thinks that sort of continuing this war is helpful because he thinks that he's inevitably going to have to resign afterwards, and he's then sort of his letting October the 7th happen, not intentionally by the way, but sort of his failures when it came to October the 7th will come to light. So at the most crude level, we are enabling someone to carry out a genocidal war just to save his own political skin. Obviously, on a more fundamental level, it goes way beyond Netanyahu, and what we are enabling is a political establishment and a political class that wants a greater Israel. The idea that we can say we're committed to a two-state solution, we object when Smotrich and the other far-right leaders say sort of nasty things about the Palestinians, but will continue to sell them arms while they carry out a war which has no purpose other than to make Gaza unlivable. What is David Lammy doing? Right? You know, he's obviously, we're going to keep hearing him sort of talking tough. I'm sure sort of when the Labour Party conference comes around in a couple of weeks, he'll try and get a few sort of rounds of applause for saying, we can't let any government breach international human rights, and we will talk tough to Israel when we need to. We won't be afraid, etc., etc. Well, then use the actual leverage that you have. And obviously, Britain isn't one of the biggest sort of sellers of arms to Israel, but we are a very important country when it comes to international diplomacy. If we were to block arms sales to Israel, that would put pressure on the Americans and the Germans, who are massive exporters of arms to Israel. So the idea that we're 10 months into this, we've heard so many words from political parties from across the West saying, oh, Israel should really temper what they're doing. We care about the human rights of Palestinians, but we're still going to sell them arms. And then obviously this brave person working in the Foreign Office who's resigned. I mean, how many more warning signs do we need before these people take some action? Because at this point, it looks pathetic. And it's more than pathetic, it's criminal, isn't it? It's the enabling of a genocidal war against an undefended people. Let's wrap up there. Slightly short today because I don't have a co-host, but there we are. Thank you for watching, and thanks everyone for tuning in this evening. The show will be back tomorrow. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.